The 15th Amendment, a change to the Constitution ratified in 1870, was supposed to be a game changer. On paper, it promised freedom, equality, and democracy for millions of newly freed African Americans. It was meant to close the final gap after the Civil War, not just ending slavery, not just granting citizenship, but guaranteeing a voice in America's democracy. For a brief moment in time, it looked like it worked. Black men lined up at polling places. Some even won elections. And for the first time, the halls of Congress echoed with the voices of formerly enslaved people and their descendants. It was a radical shift in American politics, a promise that the country was finally ready to live up to its founding ideals, that all men are created equal. Oh, except for women. Who cares about them? Many women, black and white, had fought alongside abolitionists to push for this amendment. They believed it was finally their chance, too, that the new language of equality would include them. Instead, they were left out. The amendment only addressed race, not gender. For women who had poured their energy into this fight, this was a bitter disappointment, and it caused a major split in the reform movements of the time. To make matters worse, things went off the rails very quickly for the 15th Amendment. Within just a few years, the promise of building a multiracial democracy crumbled. Violence, intimidation, and clever legal tricks stripped away the very rights the amendment was supposed to protect. Courts looked the other way. States found loopholes, and by the end of the 19th century, African Americans in the South were almost completely locked out of the political system again. So how did the 15th Amendment, hailed at first as a victory for justice, end up becoming one of the most disappointing amendments of all time? We're going to dig into what the 15th Amendment actually said, why it was supposed to change everything, and how it ended up becoming the most disappointing amendment of all time. And I see you giving me that look, all of you that know what the 16th Amendment is about. First, I salute you on knowing your amendments. Second, we're saving a different award for that amendment altogether. So just be patient and enjoy the ride. To really understand the 15th Amendment, we need to back up to the end of the Civil War, known as the Reconstruction era. On this channel, we've now covered all of the Reconstruction amendments in detail, but the quick rundown, if you're new to the channel or don't know your history, is this. After the Civil War, there was a period of rebuilding because the South was literally a crater in the ground. And part of that rebuild was bringing back Confederate states into the fold, making them swear loyalty to the Union and making sure that everyone was on Team America moving forward, as far as how the government was going to be calling the shots. In 1865, slavery was abolished by the 13th Amendment. The 14th Amendment followed in 1868, granting citizenship and equal protection under the law. But there was still a huge question. Would the newly freed black men actually have a voice in politics? Could they vote? For radical Republicans in Congress, the answer had to be yes. Otherwise, Southern states would just find ways to deny them power and keep the old system of white supremacy alive. So in 1870, the 15th Amendment was ratified. It says, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude." That's it. Pretty short, right? Just 43 words. But those words meant that African American men, many of whom had been enslaved only a few years earlier, were now legally protected from being denied the vote because of their race. And at first, it seemed to work. During Reconstruction, black men voted in huge numbers. As an example, in Louisiana, by 1868, black men made up about 44% of Louisiana's registered voters, giving them influence in elections. Similarly, South Carolina had an actual majority of black registered voters in 1868, with 63%. In statewide elections, black turnout rates were as high as 80 to 90% of those registered. They helped elect new biracial state governments in the South, and for the first time in American history, African Americans were elected to public office at every level, from local sheriffs to Congress. By 1870, there were African American senators like Hiram Revels of Mississippi and representatives like Joseph Rainey of South Carolina. It was a revolutionary moment in American democracy. But as you can imagine, not all elected positions were met with optimism. Peter Crosby, elected sheriff of Warren County, Mississippi in 1872, was a formerly enslaved man who became an influential local leader. His election sparked violent backlash, including being removed from his position by force during the Vicksburg Massacre of 1874. Okay. There's always going to be resistance to change, and you can't please everyone all the time. Why was the amendment so disappointing? Well, the amendment didn't actually guarantee the right to vote. Notice the wording. It doesn't say all male citizens have the right to vote. It only says you can't be denied because of race or color. Your legal alarm bells should be going off right now. This leaves a massive loophole. States could still invent other reasons to keep people from voting. And almost immediately, Southern states went to work figuring out how to dodge the amendment. If not by race, then by some other way. Here's how they did it. First up is poll taxes. Now, poll taxes had actually been used in some states since the colonial era and early 19th century. So this wasn't a direct consequence of the passing of the 15th Amendment. Originally, these poll taxes were mostly a way for states to raise revenue. And considering that back in the day, owning 25 acres of land with a home on it or 50 acres of vacant land was also a requirement to vote, meaning a small poll tax usually wasn't a deterrent for voters. After the passage of the 15th Amendment is when the poll tax was retooled into an instrument of disenfranchisement. States made payment of the tax a requirement for voter registration. Many also added rules like cumulative poll taxes, meaning if you missed paying in 1 year, you had to pay back taxes for all the missed years before being allowed to vote. This disproportionately affected poor people in general, black or white, but was most certainly aimed at African Americans, effectively cutting them out of the electorate. Another clever workaround for the 15th Amendment were literacy tests. Voters had to read and interpret difficult passages of the Constitution in some states, and others just asked trick questions with bait-and-switch instructions, word puzzles or logic puzzles disguised as literacy questions, and comprehension and processing under ambiguous or vague rules type questions. Now, these were loaded with confusing phrases, so that failure was very easy, or the rate to pass was nearly impossible. And you might be asking yourself, if these tests were so difficult, how did anyone pass, white or black? Well, white officials had total power to decide if you passed or failed. And spoiler alert, if you were black, you usually failed. And finally, the most elegant voter barrier was the grandfather clause. Now, the clause works like this. If your grandfather had the right to vote before the Civil War, then you could vote as well. And if he couldn't, then you weren't eligible. Good luck in the future. Maybe the next generation of your family would meet the requirements of this clause. Now, obviously, this excludes nearly all African Americans who were recently free and now able to vote. Unfortunately, 2 generations ago, even if their family were free blacks, they were unable to vote. This vicious cycle could continue infinitely for all future generations unless they married into white families. And while these barriers were put up through legal means, there was also violence and intimidation. Groups like the Ku Klux Klan threatened, beat, and even killed African Americans who tried to vote. Some police were also openly hostile in southern states to those attempting to vote. And when these tactics were challenged in court, the Supreme Court actually made things worse. In the United States versus Reese in 1876, the court ruled that the 15th Amendment didn't give people the right to vote. It only prohibited discrimination by race. That meant states could impose literacy tests or poll taxes as long as they didn't say they were about race. Other decisions, like the United States versus Cruikshank in 1876, weakened federal protection against racial violence at the polls. And this case was wild. In Colfax, Louisiana, a white supremacist mob attacked black citizens who had gathered at the local courthouse to protect Republican officeholders. This event became known as the Colfax Massacre. As many as 100 plus black men were killed, many after surrendering. When the federal prosecutors indicted several of the killers under the Enforcement Acts, which were laws passed by Congress to help enforce the 14th and 15th Amendments, for conspiring to deprive African Americans of their constitutional rights, the Supreme Court actually ruled against the federal government, overturning the convictions. The reason? The court held that the 14th Amendment only restricted state actions, not the actions of private individuals. In other words, unless a state government itself violated rights, the federal government could not step in to punish individuals. The court also said that the 15th Amendment did not guarantee the right to vote. It only prohibited states from denying the vote based on race. If individuals, like the mob that killed these black voters, prevented black men from voting, that wasn't a federal issue. The message was clear. The federal government wasn't going to step in to protect black voters. By the 1890s, nearly every southern state had locked in new constitutions that effectively wiped black men off the voter rolls. In Mississippi, for example, black voter registration dropped from about 67% in 1867 to less than 6% by 1892. So while the 15th Amendment was supposed to expand democracy, the reality was the opposite. African Americans were silenced and pushed out of politics for decades. And then there's another layer of disappointment. The amendment said nothing about gender. Specifically, women, both black and white, were still denied the right to vote. This caused a split in the reform movements of the time. Leaders like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton argued that the 15th Amendment betrayed women. They formed the National Woman Suffrage Association. Now, others, like Lucy Stone, supported the 15th as a step forward, but admitted it left women behind. The belief was basically black men gaining the vote first was a moral and political necessity after slavery. It was progress toward equality, and women will be next up. Now, Lucy Stone formed the American Woman Suffrage Association, but it would be nearly 50 years before another amendment would be written about voting. So, why does the 15th Amendment still matter if it was so disappointing? Because even though it was weakened by states and the Supreme Court, it stayed in the Constitution. And that gave civil rights activists a foundation to demand change later. When the civil rights movement gained momentum in the 1950s and 1960s, leaders pointed directly to the 15th Amendment to argue that America was breaking its own promises. This, of course, leads us to the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, where the federal government finally began, actually enforcing the 15th Amendment in a meaningful way. Literacy tests were banned, federal officials were sent to protect elections, and millions of African Americans were finally able to vote without fear. It only took roughly 100 years, but the 15th Amendment was not forgotten. So was the 15th Amendment a failure, or was it an important stepping stone? On the one hand, it gave hope, but allowed states to undermine it almost immediately. On the other hand, it laid the groundwork for future civil rights victories. Maybe the best way to think about it is this. The 15th Amendment shows us that laws alone aren't enough. You need enforcement, accountability, and the political will to protect rights. But what do you think? Was the 15th Amendment a broken promise or a necessary first step? Let me know down in the comments section below. I also want to give out a huge shout out to my Patreon cabinet members, Howard and Kevin. Thank you so much for your support. If you want to support this channel, becoming a member on my Patreon is the best way to do it. Okay, that's it for now. Thanks so much for sticking to the end of my video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. We'll make more videos soon.